Hello and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in business and in life and simplify them. And friends, boy, do I have the topic for you today, because I feel like we all could just proverbial raise our hand right now in agreement to what I'm about to say. Have you, in the last 6 to 12 months, ever bought a book you didn't finish, an online course that you had good intentions but never really got to the end, I don't know, a DIY project around your house, or maybe you had big aspirational goals of losing X number of pounds or running a marathon or writing a book, and you never quite got there? Why is that? Let's simplify that. Well, my special guest today, her name is Bridgit Dengel Gaspard, and she is the author of the book, The Final Eighth. And she's also the founder of the New York Voice Dialogue Institute. Now, she's a former performer who's earned her master's degree from Columbia University. She teaches at numerous professional settings, including Omega Institute. She lives in New York City, and she has a private practice where it specifically helps people get unstuck and cross the finish line on their major projects and goals. So I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast, Bridgit Dengel Gaspard. Hey, Bridgit.
Hi, Mary. It's great to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. And, the part where I said, you buy a book and then you don't finish the book. You and your publisher have given me your book, and I haven't finished the book. Like, I really wanted to finish the book before you and I had this conversation. But what is that? Like, why does that happen? What's going on there?
You're like a living reader, a living example of this.
Gosh.
Well, it happens for a lot of reasons. And one of them can be realistic, like time. But if it continues to happen that you don't finish, especially when you're close to the finish line, like you get to chapter 13 out of 14 or that kind of thing, I think what happens is that you start to be in a tug of war between different parts of yourself, the parts of you that want to finish and the parts of you that are somehow against that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think that what also happens for me is like you have good intentions. I'm using air quotes here. And your heart's in the right place, but then you prioritize time in different ways, right? Or you just, you put other things ahead of it. Is there other things at play here?
Yes, absolutely. So there's that. But then what parts of you are basically running your schedule? Mm-hmm. So if it's really an important goal, and you get it done, it's because the parts of you that needed to get it done just are in alignment, use all the skills necessary and get the thing done. But what a lot of people don't realize is that there are underground parts of ourselves that might distract you. And so it's often mysterious, like, I know I want this and I'm working hard for it. It came to me when I was working with my clients that I knew to be creative, talented, dedicated, and hardworking. And so those usual excuses they couldn't use. They really were not procrastinating.
Right. They're driven people. Yeah.
They're driven and yet they would stall in front of the finish line.
Oh, God. I mean, like that, you basically described me on a lot of projects in the last few years. And I don't think that that's uncommon, right? Like, I mean, I have coaching clients as well who have gone through our masterminds and fizzle out about halfway through. What is the thing that's underneath that? You talk about the final eighth. Like, how do you define that?
So it literally came to me in my practice, and the term just came to my head because at a certain point I saw this phenomenon, and you're exactly right. So, and working with people, again, they're not in denial. Mm-hmm. But I think what happens are a few things. One is you enter a new identity when you go from being a contender to being a victor. Mm. And society doesn't have a lot of time and space for success issues. You could almost get made fun of. Oh, let me get out the violin. Are you having a success issue? But in fact, you potentially are, because it's scary to be bigger. And especially when it's an important goal, you're exposed and you're vulnerable. You care. That's why you're going after this goal. And so the parts of you that are scared suddenly come up and they're like, ooh, ooh, wait a minute, is this what we really want? Are we ready? And so in a lot of our work, we listen to that. There's wisdom to that. And maybe the answer is not quite. Maybe you're not quite ready.
Yeah.
And then you can shift the work to the parts of you that you need to strengthen so you can actually practice what I like to call safe success.
It's so interesting to me because I think, if all things are rooted in fear and, like, oh, I don't want to play big. I just want to play small and I'll stay in this little bubble and, I'll push that off to later and later and later becomes never, right? Is it always self-sabotage at play? Or is there other kind of, as you say, inner voices that are, inner selves that are at play?
Well, it's funny that you say that little voice, I'll just stay over here. In my book, I outline this technique called voice dialogue, where we speak to different voices, but that's a real self, the one that actually speaks with a higher level and kind of scared and not very intimidating.
Yep.
So to start to notice these selves. And so the other thing that I think happens is that it could be a form of self-sabotage, but the way I look at it, like that's a negative label. Let's look at these parts of you. And those parts may not call themselves sabotage parts. They might say self-protection. And once we find out what those are and deal with those concerns directly, because they all have wisdom. In my long time doing this, I've never seen a self that didn't have, from its point of view, a very valid point. Now, it could be outdated. And that's another thing my book takes you through is maybe it's no longer true, but it was once true. And so sometimes I call this like a refresher. You get to push refresh on yourselves and bring everyone up to date so that the original things you were scared of, they're not in play anymore.
Yeah. Well, and I remember early on in the book, you tell a story of a gentleman who's trying to lose a certain number of pounds, before his 10th wedding anniversary. And he was like so frustrated that he couldn't get there. But his wife was able to hit the goal fast. And I remember you mentioned a story about, one of his inner selves was that little Louie, the child that, who used to go out for cheeseburgers and fries with his dad, and there's that nostalgia part in that comfort piece, right? And that's another piece of what you're saying, right? Like those personas or inner selves that are from a deep-rooted place that no longer serve you, right?
Exactly. And in that case, all the work shifted that we were doing. And he even said, I thought we were going to double down and you were just going to be boring and tedious and make me like work harder. And I don't take that personally. I'm like, yeah, you can think that. Yeah. No, what we found out was that was a very vulnerable part of himself. And he actually held a lot of grief and love for his dad, who had passed suddenly. And so our work shifted to just letting that part of him, little Louie, express his feelings. Yeah. And what happened was that he had this goal and he was in love still with his wife and was looking forward to getting his vows renewed. But this part of him, he had squelched for so long. It's like this part played itself out, made itself known through these trips to the unhappy meal, as he called them, at Burger King, because that's finally what made my client realize, oh, I have to pay attention. And that's the other gift of the final eighth. If you could just cross that finish line and enjoy the triumph, great. I'm not against just enjoying the triumph, but often it's the only way you'll listen to this part of yourself is in the difficulty that it's causing you.
It's such an interesting way to tackle what I know a lot of us have gone through. And maybe we just never tackled it with this kind of a framework and solutions. And this is what I'm excited about. So I want you to simplify it. So you call it voice dialogue, like specifically speaking to your multiple inner selves. And side note, we're not talking about multiple personality disorder. We're not talking about that whatsoever, but actually getting that clarity and insight from your inner self. So talk us through, what is voice dialogue? How do we use it?
So voice dialogue was created by my mentors, Hal and Sidra Stone. And I stumbled upon them and I read about this work in another person's book. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And the premise is that our healthy personality consists of many selves. You're right. It's not about Sybil. Sybil is actually trauma related, and that's a real mental illness. This is not that. This is that we are the multiplicity of selves, as Walt Whitman likes to say. So the idea is that we've got many selves, and voice dialogue literally says, okay, you start in center and then you go to a different self of yours and you talk as that self. And energetically, physiologically, mentally, this self has its own point of view. And so let's say I go to my good girl. And my good girl will have different posture. Like I'll move over and my good girl might be more upright and maybe a little more constrained. And so I can feel this in my body. And part of what I do is help people notice it in themselves. And so from the good girl's point of view, I'll have an opinion about Bridgit. And we use that third person. And I'll say, well, I want Bridgit to be lovely to everybody and this, that, and the other. And I have all my rules and my preferences. So when I talk as good girl, I will never be asked to just be a little looser. So voice dialogue really honors those parts. So when I come back and it's the good girl, a few things happens. Me, Bridgit in the center, I'm like, oh, that's not all of me. For some people, they realize, wow, I don't have to listen to all those rules that this particular self has. Then I can go to the other self, which could be anything. But in this case, let's just say the bad girl. And I mean that in a good way. So we can go over here and bad girl maybe doesn't even sit. And so in voice dialogue, bad girl could walk around and you see the energy and maybe she curses and she's like, I don't want to be bored and this, that, and the other. What's the gift of bad girl? And then we come back to center. And now me, I have access to both kinds of energy, both wisdom. And if I only did my wild agenda through bad girl, my life might be in shambles. I might have a lot of fun stories, but not a lot of functionality.
Yeah.
But if good girl keeps control, I won't take risks. I won't say what I mean. I'll be super nice to everybody. And I might even get sick because of all the squelching I'm doing.
Right.
And so what voice dialogue does is make you realize you're so much more than you think you are. And it's so much fun. It's literally fun.
And I can see the value in that because I think, just speaking from my own experience, especially when I am in a state of pity party or victimhood and I'm like, oh, I can't, I'm just in it, and stuck wherever I've been in my life. You tend to take on that identity as this is the truth. This is me 100%, and there is no hope because I only see this. What it sounds like with voice dialogue is that you can step yourself out of it. You can let that part of you have a voice and be acknowledged, but then also have sort of a separation from it to say, okay, this isn't fully me. This is just a part of what I'm feeling. Do I have it right?
Absolutely. And that alone, you use the word we use, which is separation, is liberating. That's not all of me. Also, we humans have a lot of rules, some of them amazing, like no, you cannot throw your toy wherever you want, whenever you want, and hurt people. That we need to keep that. Yes. On the other hand, a lot of times we have rules we don't even realize we're operating by. Like I like to say, a lot of people are still operating by their elementary school rules of success. And then they wonder why they're not taken seriously or why they choke at the important meeting, but they do all the admin stuff beautifully. But when they have to be the teacher in the room as opposed to the student, they lose it. And so I even have an exercise in my book, which might be a little taboo, called the blameography. So if I were working with you and you were like, we had the pity party, I'm like, let's go to pity party and let's write a blameography and just label whose fault is it that you are X, Y, and Z? And that is so freeing. Yeah. And then you get this energy like, all right, well, actually, maybe some of those things are maybe true. But either way, I'm not doomed today just because it actually was so-and-so's fault that such and such happened. But it's a way to validate what really happened and to separate out from thoughts you hadn't thought of or just stuff that doesn't fit anymore. It's like, okay, I'm ready to really live differently.
Yeah. And I guess what I have learned over the years, and I'm 42 at the time of this recording, so I still have a long way to go. But I certainly did not know this in my 20s. That's for sure. Is that not every thought it needs to be believed? Not every thought is real.
Yes.
But to give in space and to acknowledge those thoughts and feelings and emotions is really critically important. And that's what it sounds like the voice Gestalt work is really all about, is
It's,
not
yeah,
suppressing, but actually acknowledging and feeling it and go and
exactly.
processing through, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's very validating. And I like to say, and it kind of goes against maybe what some people are taught, like you were saying, I didn't know this in my 20s myself, is that these are parts of you that hold the story of what happened. And if something bad happened, they're not to be gotten rid of. They don't get to run today's show, but they're gentle parts of you that did go through stuff and they become your strength. It's like, wow, you survived that, but they don't have to go. And everyone feels like I need to get rid of my victim. And I have another wonderful exercise, which is what are 5 good things about X? Even what are 5 good things about your victim self? Things like that. Because one is, if you'd like to do it with me, is that you can recognize perpetrators if you are in touch with your victim,
Yeah.
or know how to operate on a more subtle level if you need to.
Yeah.
Can you think of a couple of gifts of
Yeah.
like a victim self?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can see that. I mean, for me, well, let's just be real. 2020 was a curveball for a lot of us, and it's not over yet. And
No.
so a lot of things changed this year, and luckily our business has been fine. But a lot of my clients' businesses, all of a sudden, their client base disappeared overnight. So,
Yes.
I can imagine that feeling of like, oh, what am I going to do? Like the things that I thought were true are no longer true in how the world works. And that's tough. Yeah, it's
It
really
is
tough.
tough. And I think that's also where the final eighth and voice dialogue is so helpful, because it literally is a technique to help you get in touch with different parts of yourself. And some of that, absolutely, between COVID and all of the stuff that's happening as a result, and the fires all around the globe and those kind of
Yeah.
things, you have to be able to access different parts of yourself. So the idea is you either do it or you don't, but it's mandated. And so I agree. I mean, before COVID, people developmentally had to access different parts of themselves, and some of it is wonderful. You weren't a parent and now you are a parent, but it could also be you get a diagnosis or
Right.
different things that happen. Or another one is final eighth is so many people that are all but dissertation going after their PhD, but they don't quite finish it to get their doctorate, so they don't get to wear the robe of I am Dr. So and so. So, but COVID for sure. We've never had this happen on such a global level where
Yes.
so much and ideally, if you move into different parts of yourself, you're not in denial about the loss, but you're strengthening the parts that are like, all right, well, what are other things? Maybe I've always wanted to try something else. Maybe now is actually the best time, even though I
Right.
didn't plan it, but here it is.
Right. And then what I hear in that is that when you start to acknowledge the voices that are inside and process the feelings that you're feeling, you can start to shift it and change perspective on what's happening to you. And that's the key. So you're not just
Yeah.
sitting in it. You're not just letting this thing happen without feeling like any sort of empowerment. This is part of the process to heal, pivot, thrive, move on, right?
Exactly. It's very empowering. I mean,
Yeah.
it's expansive. It's transformational, really.
Yeah. So in the book, you talk about a double bind. What's a double bind?
A double bind is like the proverbial between a rock and a hard place. And so that's obviously you have nowhere to go. And so the double bind is when the final eighth happens and you're stuck. And I really literally mean, so you have parts of you that are for the goal, believe you can do it, worked hard to get there. And then the other parts suddenly have ground you to a halt and they're against the goal.
Yeah.
Even if it's fear, as opposed to fact. Like it may be that the reason they're against the goal is not a factual reason, but what is a fact is you're stuck. And so that's the inner double bind, the inside job, and finding out what the selves care about on this part, and then dealing directly helps literally loosen, as you said, separate, so that other things come in and the double bind kind of relaxes.
That sounds incredible. So what about your core values? I mean, because I feel like that's part of what we hear a lot. And one of the things I thought was interesting in your book is that you started to talk about core negative beliefs as well. Like, why is it important to uncover both of those?
So the core negative beliefs, and this comes out of cognitive behavioral therapy, but of which I'm trained in as well. But basically, early on, we get a negative worldview. Those of us that do, for some reason, the world's not safe, I'm not good enough. Core negative beliefs are incredibly painful, and so we protect against them. And so we have certain selves that believe them, and so they're out to protect you. Every self is out to protect you, even if they're dysfunctional. So if it's true that you're not good enough, it's never true. But if that's the belief that you have, certain selves are going to jump into action. Okay, it's true you're not good enough, but you could be perfect and you could work really hard and we can make it so that you're as unassailable as possible. And so what happens is a lot of amazing skills get built. And so that core negative belief is hidden under all of this accomplishment. But if it's only in relation to proving whether or not it's true you're good enough, eventually that core negative belief is going to show up. And that's the other part of the tug of war that happens, of the double bind. And those parts believe it's true. And those are the why bother, never mind, you, not you, maybe other people can have success. And those are painful. Yeah. But once you start to identify them and then literally bring them up to speed, like, wait a minute, it may be true that I made decisions that I'm now sad about, as if it was true. It's not. And how wonderful is that? Is it true I will never be an astronaut? Yes. Is it true that I'm stupid? No. And so many people conflate that, even though logically it doesn't make sense, and logical people have all kinds of rational reasons, and they are indeed brilliant, but there's all these other selves they need to get in touch with that aren't in that arena. And that's why I think it's so important to learn about your core negative beliefs. And if you don't have them, that's great. But most people have them deep down somewhere.
Yeah. So how do we begin to uncover them if they're really deep rooted? What's the first question to ask, or, maybe a writing prompt? What would you recommend?
I always say you can start with your inner critic.
Yeah.
Ask your inner critic, and that's a great writing prompt. Hey, inner critic, and you can use your own self, like in the third person. Hey, inner critic, what do you think of Bridgit? If I wrote that, my inner critic would have a field day, and there's where you're going to find your core negative beliefs. And another question I love, how do you know what you know? And you ask the inner critic that, not as in prove yourself to me, but no, literally, inner critic, how do you know? Well, your teacher this, and, they have their proof of why they're right. But in fact, when you look at it from the third person, you're like, I see that you believe it, but it's not true. So that's a great one.
And I think this is what's so interesting. I've had this conversation in different ways with different people on the podcast. And is it the part of this, the data points, your brain trying to collect data points to prove your thought process, right? So like, for example, if you are desperately wanting to adopt a dog and you see people with dogs everywhere in your neighborhood and you see, everybody's got a dog except for me kind of thing, right? Like, is it that? Is that what's at play?
Yeah. Yeah, so we would call those the primary selves. And we lead with the primary selves, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they are constantly collecting data points. See, so-and-so is amazing.
Right.
Look what happened to her, but not you. So that distortion proves the core negative belief. It's not true. It doesn't really prove it, but to that perspective, yes, I love that. All that you could draw a picture with those data points of that big black cloud of not you, don't even bother. And that's the tragedy. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
Right. And hello, my goodness, if you have not seen the documentary that's out on Netflix right now, The Social Dilemma, this is all about, and I'll put the link in the show notes for people, this is all about how the social media networks are actually behind the scenes manipulating what it is that we are seeing in our feed. And that's perfect. Like from a business point of view of thinking about when you see, maybe competitors or colleagues and their beautifully cultivated and filtered Instagram feed, and you think they have this and I don't seem to have anything. Like there's something very deep at play here as well, feeding into this negative core belief, right?
It's devastating. If you are in a vulnerable state with your negative core belief and that pops up, it can be devastating.
Yeah.
I agree.
Woof. So then what do you think is the key difference between a person who actually sets a goal and hits the goal and achieves the goal easily versus those who don't?
I think a lot of it has to do with lack of ambivalence. They're not ambivalent. So let's take this theoretical person. So if someone is kind of physiologically and biologically predisposed to a certain thing and also likes it and more or less gets access to it. So let's just say some athletic type of person kind of likes this sport that is made available to them and then does really well and then just physically enjoys it and has had the experience of, well, you just kind of apply yourself and things work out. And then that attitude, those set of primary cells, we would say in voice dialogue, then goes to college and says, oh, I'm going to try chemistry. I kind of like how these things work. And then just continues. And so from that point of view, they might say, oh, I had a little trouble here or this or that. But there's no real ambivalence. They're allowed to be competitive in terms of internal permission. And so I think those that don't, there's some lack of permission. And that's also what this book talks about. Somewhere in there that just as you're getting close, you're like allowed a lot of permission to work hard, but not a lot of permission to be victorious. And so that's, I think, a big difference. And again, there's nothing wrong with either.
Yeah.
But having the trouble about not being able to accomplish your goal and then seeing someone who looks like they're doing it so easily, back to your data points, then that could feed the core negative belief loop. And it's not true. However, it's deflating and demoralizing. And then it becomes true that you are spending a lot of time not accomplishing your goal.
A self-fulfilled prophecy, right?
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
I think a lot of times when I have not finished something, let's say, for example, here's an example. I'll be the first and I'll be a little bit vulnerable in saying this. A goal of mine in 2019 was to submit for a TEDx talk. And I was like, I could do that. Like, I am a public speaker. I know things. I have been business for a long time. There's no reason why I couldn't have done the thing, right? And it was a goal and I just didn't accomplish it. And I, looking at the framework that your book has with the final eighth and, what we talked about today, I think that there is a bit of, okay, well, what is actually going on there is potentially it's like, well, if nobody knows that I didn't do the goal, then does the goal still exist? And then it's like, oh, you kind of like, you just pretend it's not a thing and then you just carry on to another thing. I feel like that there's something to that. Do you see that as well with your clients?
Absolutely. So like if taking what you shared, and I appreciate your sharing that, I might say list the selves that want to do it and list the selves that don't want to do it, whatever that means, or didn't do it, including a very wonderful self that you just referred to. This is how I would look at it, but you tell me if you agree, is the one that's like, listen, it's like the tree didn't fall if no one heard it. That's a self that's so protective because it's protecting your vulnerability.
Yeah.
But that self often helps you not succeed. It helps you like, let's just play it safe. Okay, you can apply and just see if you know anyone in the TEDx world, but don't act like it's for somebody else.
Yeah.
This kind of self. And so you honor that part. But then here in center, you're owning it now and you say, thank you. But actually, I'm stronger now. I don't need to do everything on the down low necessarily.
Yep, totally. So I am curious then, Bridgit, as you're writing this book yourself, did you hit up on your own final eighth?
It is the story of my not finishing. I can no longer say the joke. I'm working on my book that I'm not finishing about not finishing because it's out now.
Well done, you.
It's I call myself a wounded healer. I lived this final eighth and I talk about it in the book a few times. And I was one of those people, so it never made sense because I did work hard. I knew I did. I wasn't a procrastinator. And there's nothing wrong with procrastinators, but I was like, people would say, it's just showing up. That's all that matters. And I'd say, well, good for you, but I show up about 12 to 14 hours every day, most days. That just doesn't feel like my problem. And I didn't know what was going on. It was like blind spots. And even with voice dialogue, which I loved, But it wasn't until I began to realize that parts of myself were attached to my core negative belief, and that they were distortedly loyal to my early caregivers who gave me that core belief. And that in fact, that's where I was. In some level, it felt like really going through and getting past my finish line. I had to process a lot of selves that really found that unsafe. And I have an exercise in my book. People don't talk about envy a lot. And I talk about envy because one of the secrets is that everyone's doesn't like to feel envious. And I don't either. It's very painful, and it's meant to be. It's designed to be. But the other side of the coin is being envied is also not fun or helpful necessarily. And so in my book, I do have a section called Practice Safe Success. Like, if you really are living your fullness, you are going to attract envy. So the goal isn't like, I hope everybody's all goodness and light, and so I won't have to deal with it. That's nice. You can have that part near you. But then what's another part that will deal with it? And so I've got some great exercises because, again, it's for those that are allowed to be competitive, like somehow their competitive selves were welcome where they grew up. A lot of people have very mixed feelings about what I'm terming competitive. There could be other language for it. And so, yeah, this is a story where I had to go searching, and I was lucky to find. And so I worked on this book for many years because I put it away, that kind of thing. And I'd like to add one more thing, though. Part of me was making it a final 8th issue, which it was, like the parts of me that didn't want to finish. But what I also realized is it needed those years that I was working. Yeah. It was part of the process. So sometimes it's not a final 8th issue per se. It's that self that says, no, it's not ready, is not a procrastinator. Because I never would have gotten to the part about the double bind. That came later. And so that's the other thing I say to people, that there really is wisdom. And this part that you're accusing of being your procrastinator stuck self, maybe it's saying, no, there's more juice here. Just give it time, because you're going to have much more gold if you just let the process work.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing.
And that I think is really interesting if you think about when you make a spaghetti bolognese sauce from scratch, right?
No.
If you eat it in the first 20 minutes, it's not going to taste as rich and beautiful and developed unless you just let it simmer for an hour or two on the stove, right? Same here is what we're talking about, right? Some things that you're wanting to birth and put out into the world, a book or whatever it might be, maybe takes a little bit of time to actually live and experience and marinate and deepen as well. There maybe sometimes it's procrastination. Maybe it is something deeper going on.
Right. And also in terms of simplifying, faster and quicker sometimes poses as simpler, and it's not always.
100%. Yeah, 100% agree. Well, I encourage anybody that's listening to this episode, if you're curious about this, I have loved the book. I will promise to finish the book. And honestly, I think you and I talked offline about this. Like, sometimes if you finish halfway and you got what you needed, then that's fine, right? Permission granted. But this book is available wherever books are sold, and it's called The Final 8th. Enlist your inner selves to accomplish your goals. And I also want to encourage anyone that's listening you're invited to attend her free virtual launch event, which is happening on Friday, September 25th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Eastern. So we'll put all the links in the show notes for you guys to go and RSVP to attend that, because I think it's quite fun to actually be with people from all over the world to take part of that virtual event. So again, the website to find out more information about this book is final8th.com. But again, the links are all in the show notes at thesimplifierspodcast.com as well. So, Bridgit, I have a couple of questions as we wrap up that I like to ask everybody that comes on the podcast. So here we go. First question is this. What's one book or blog that you're reading these days that's either inspiring you or poking holes and challenging your belief system?
A book that I'm reading right now that I love is Liminal Dreaming by Jennifer Dumpert. And it's about how you can capture your imagination between sleep and wake, whether it's going to bed or waking up. And I figured with the Simplifiers, this is time that's already on your schedule. You have to go from sleep to wake and wake to sleep. But the idea you can catch some higher wisdom. And whatever your consciousness is and subconscious is playing with.
Very cool. I've not heard that book, so we'll link that up in the show notes for people as well. So tell us, who's one person in your network, somebody that you know personally, you just feel is up to brilliant things that we could shine a spotlight on them, and who knows, maybe one day we'll have them on the podcast as well.
Laura Zam. She's amazing. She wrote the book, The Pleasure Plan, and it's a book about her sexual healing. But she loves to talk about how you can add pleasure to your life and sexually and sensually. Because if one person in a relationship has a sexual issue, the whole relationship is affected. And she's amazing. And her book is filled with very specific suggestions and literal references. And she's funny and warm. And it's amazing. And it's a topic that's hard to talk about.
I'm sure quite a few people's ears perked up when you said that as well. So again, we'll link her up in the show notes so people can check her out. So I believe that gratitude and simplicity go hand in hand. Tell me, what are you grateful for today?
Hal Stone, who has passed in this last couple months, was my mentor along with Sidra, but he passed away at 93 in his sleep, and he co-created Voice Dialogue with Sidra. They had an amazing relationship, fruitful personally and professionally. And without him, I wouldn't have written the book, without both of them. But he believed in me, and I loved him, and that's who I'm grateful for.
Incredible. So is there one place online where people can connect with you, either through your website or through social media?
Final8th.com is my website, and you can look me up social media-wise that way, or my name, Bridgit Dengel Gaspard. I'm all over.
Great. And we'll put all of those links in the show notes so you guys can check them out from Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and beyond. So my final question for you today is this, Bridgit. And again, thank you so much for your time. You're such a pleasure to chat with. Someone somewhere is listening to this episode right now, and she has a huge project that she's been saying she's going to be doing for months now. And I'm not just talking about myself. What's one thing you could whisper into her ear right now just to encourage her in this moment?
I would whisper, whatever parts of you are up front right now, ask them what they think. What wisdom are they trying to share so you don't fight yourself? Be curious about yourself.
Bridgit, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. What a pleasure.